I'm not a urban studies person or anything like that, so I might say something silly, in case apologies. This is a version of a talk I gave at a conference last week called Anthropology, AI, and the Future of Human Society. And we're talking about basically the way in which how we design cities using tools can affect culture. So, urban design is kind of, this idea of creating towns and spaces and cities that do certain things. And that design can then affect the culture that springs up within that city. So on the top there, you can see a very kind of classic example of a plaza where you have kind of this cafe culture. You can see the alfresco dining places and so on. Below, you can see an urban plan for, I think it was Paris, where they wanted to take everything and put them in big tall buildings, which then would affect a very different culture. So you're not going to have a very good cafe culture if you're all in big tower blocks because you have less kind of, space. Whereas there, you've got nice plazas, you can have some alfresco dining and so on. But not only does urban design affect your culture, it also affects the environment. So certain urban designs can affect different kinds of natural hazard risk. So lots of impervious surfaces can lead to flooding, and urban heat island effect is a very common phenomenon that occurs in heat waves and things like this. And similarly, that environment then affects the urban area. So like certain cities spring up to have fit different topographies and things like this. There we go. So the reason I talk about natural hazards is because urban heat island, where cities are hotter than the kind of surrounding countryside, is a really common phenomenon and is becoming more and more of a big issue because the world is becoming increasingly urbanized and heat waves are getting worse because of climate change. And in fact, in Europe, of the top 10 most lethal weather events, 10 of them are heat waves. This links into a side project I'm working on with some friends where we've been producing kind of models for forecasting urban heat, land surface temperature given certain kind of interpolated weather station air temperature data, which uses some kind of machine learning models to do this and takes into account topography and so on and so on and so on. And you can see there an example of a temperature map for a hot day in London that we've generated. So what we want to do is then kind of take this and see, can you then use it to inform design of new areas? So both manually in the sense of, I know that parks make things cooler and so on, but also in a more automated sense. So what I've done here is I've taken the buildings and parks for London, kind of represented them as pixels, and then built a very simple logistic regression model that takes into account topography, so slope, aspect, and elevation, and then outputs whether, what the land cover is. So in the case of either building or park or none. And what this does is it basically produces a urban plan with a certain set of kind of building footprints for a given topography. Then what we can do is we can feed that into the heat model and then kind of see how that performs in a thermal sense and compare a bunch of designs against each other. So these are just kind of two random examples I've taken for London. So on the left there are the real areas for that topography, and on the right are the model generations. And on the bottom are the heat forecasts. And you can see on the left, obviously, it looks like a normal city. There's buildings and streets and stuff. And on the right, you've got the building patterns and these very kind of weird looking alien designs. And this is something you might be familiar with if you've seen things like Autodesk's generative design feature for creating tools and parts and things. The machine doesn't necessarily have a sense of human design aesthetics. But the interesting thing about that is that if we think back to the previous thing about what culture that kind of facilitates, you might have things such as squares and parks and stuff that facilitate, for example, a cafe culture on the left, whereas on the right you have a very different kind of culture that would be generated by that because you've got these weird shapes. So in this sense, when we're then kind of collaborating between humans and machines to design stuff like this, we've got to think about the alignment between those two things that I'm sure you guys already know about, but also when we look back to it about the type of architecture used and so on, and then also the data sources. So I've been using this kind of London-centric data, which means we're going to have a very specific set of norms in that model, even though they've produced those weird things that don't look like London. It's based on some London-based data and has these kind of ideas of certain cultural origins and things, but also brings in the vernacular architecture and things like kind of more human-centric designs for urban spaces, where you have people kind of build houses like that naturally versus those very strange-looking automatically generated shapes. And this is kind of something which isn't necessarily new. You've got these things here, which is like parametric architecture, where you can have kind of computers help fill in and design things to generate new spaces. But the ones there look a bit weird, and that's actually from a paper talking about how those things can look quite uncanny and make people feel uncomfortable. So I guess the kind of questions here are like, when we look back to those previous models, the generated city plans, what mode, how are those things useful, and kind of what mode of collaboration between humans and machines do you want to use for those kinds of things? And that's it. Thank you very much.